Welcome to the 56th episode of the Lessons from the Cockpit podcast. I am your host, Mark Hassera, and for over 60 years, my passion has been aviation. I have been an airplane nerd since I was 5 years old, building model airplanes with my good buddy Mike Reed, who's been on this show, and reading books about famous aviators. On the Lessons from the Cockpit show, we dissect the tactics, techniques, and procedures that are used in extreme and extraordinary military, commercial, and even private flying operation. Our purpose is to explore how does the aviation world work, and more importantly, expand critical thinking skills both in the air and on the ground. And some of these stories that we tell here are being told for the very first time. The Lessons from the Cockpit show is financed and supported through Wall Pilot, custom aviation art for the walls of your home, office, or hangar. These are 4, 6, and 8 foot long decals that you peel off the vinyl backing and stick to any flat surface. And you'll be happy to know some of our patches that we've done for some of our customers have been on trucks and even boats that are traveling around the Gulf of Mexico and are still there and have not faded. These are extremely detailed left or right hand profiles of your favorite aircraft. And when I mean detailed, I'm talking about you can even read the stenciling on the missiles of a lot of the aircraft that we produce. We've done everything from World War I, we're working on helicopters, World War II, Korean War, Vietnam, and even the war against terror with a lot of the modern fighters. We also do a lot of custom work where you tell us what's your favorite airplane or the airplane that you flew. We can put your name, your unit badges, your tail number and tail codes, even your favorite weapons on a custom print. So go to wallpilot.com and look at the 126 ready to print items or fill out the custom form and we'll draw it up for you. The 2 helicopters we're working on right now are all versions of the Apache and the SH-3 Sea King helicopter, which I don't know a lot about helicopters, so it's taken us a while. Notice today I talked about tactics, techniques, and procedures. I want to talk a little bit about something that I did in the air refueling community that I always looked forward to and had a lot of fun doing. And this was because we were being sneaky and doing things under the radar, literally. So grab an adult beverage of your choice, sit down, strap in, and let's discuss the obvious and not so obvious reasons why and how we do low altitude air refueling and the tactics and techniques and procedures that we use in order to train to this, and a couple examples of real world situations where low altitude air refueling was accomplished, and one of them's pretty scary in the Middle East. Since the dawn of time, and men and women have been fighting wars, adversaries have always tried to hide what they're doing. They've done it with the clothes that they're wearing and camouflage, through information warfare and putting out propaganda and lies and half-truths, to means of tactical deception like the Trojan horse and it going through the gates of the city of Troy, hiding all the soldiers inside that later take over the city. It has always been easy to disguise oneself from the Mark I eyeball. And the Mark I eyeball, according to science, can see to a horizon of only about 3 miles away. They can see through smoke and haze normally about 12 miles away with the naked eyeball. The invention of radar during World War II was a huge advantage on a battlefield. Those of you that watched the Battle of Britain movie, I think it came out in the late 60s, saw these huge radar masts along the coast of England put there to detect the Luftwaffe bombers and fighters coming toward London. Erman Goering knew that one of his first target sets had to be this radar chain system if he was going to be successful. And on the first couple days of the Battle of Britain, Ju-87 Stuka dive bombers were attacking the radar masts and the radar stations along the British coast. Radar has now become from a one-dimensional system to literally a three-dimensional system that can see to the surface to 300,000 feet and beyond its radar horizon. But that radar horizon has now become a problem because at a certain point, even a radar on a 50-foot mast has a blind spot beyond the curve of the Earth. There's a really easy formula that the military uses to determine where that radar horizon and dead space is. And it's done through an algebraic formula. To figure out the distance of your radar horizon and where that blind spot along the curve of the Earth is, that distance is determined by the square root of the height of the radar times 1.23. For all you mathematicians out there that are listening to my show, I realize that there's a longer formula for this. Being a political science guy like I am, I need the math simple. I'm not going to do the circumference of the Earth and the Pythagorean theorem and figuring that all out. Just tell me the distance is equal to the square root of the height of the radar times 1.23. So let me give you some examples of radar horizon. If you put a long-range, three-dimensional air search radar on top of a 40-foot mountain, the square root of 40 is 6.324. So multiplying that times 1.23, that means that radar's radar horizon is about 77 miles away. Now let's take the case of the E-3 Airborne Warning and Control System, or AWACS airplane, that the Air Force commonly flies with its big search radar. Typically, the E-3 is flying at about 30,000 feet. And the square root of 30,000 is 173.205. Multiplying that number by 1.23 gives you a radar horizon of 213 nautical miles. This is why the AWACS is such an advantage to our airborne forces. It has this incredible radar look, but it still has a limitation of seeing below the radar horizon and that dark space beyond the curve of the Earth from 30,000 feet. And you see, folks, this is why the joint force is so important. If you tie an E-3 AWACS and network it with an Aegis cruiser or destroyer, you have a really, really good radar picture out to a couple hundred miles. But you still have that limitation where there is this dark space below the horizon that airplanes can exploit. And this is a planning factor that we went through all of the time when we were planning and executing air campaigns over the Middle East, which is relatively flat, or say over North Korea, where you have pretty mountainous terrain, or Afghanistan, where some of the mountains go to 19, 20,000 feet. You'll have holes in your radar coverage because of mountainous terrain. And how do you fill that in? You put up more airplanes that have good radar systems on them. E-2 Hawkeye, E-3 AWACS, the Brits have E-3s, the French have their AWACS airplanes, the Australians have a 737 called a wedge-tail. All of this is used to be able to figure out how I can detect airborne objects at least beyond the radar horizon, because all of this translates into minutes of warning. If I can have 20 to 30 minutes of warning that something's coming at me, then I can prepare. If it's only 5 minutes because it's only 15 miles away from a ground-based radar, well, then I've got problems. The Brits really suffered with this during the Falklands War because they did not have deployed with them an airborne warning and control system. Everything was being done by ship. So their radars were on top of their masts at, say, 40 feet, and they were working also in these straits with mountainous terrain. The Argentines were flying their Daggers and A4 Skyhawks at very low levels in order to exploit the radar coverage of the British Joint Task Force that had been sent down there to deal with it. It was driving Admiral Sandy Woodward nuts because he lost a couple ships to these low-flying A4 Skyhawks and French Daggers dropping 500-pound bombs on his ships. They didn't have have enough warning. And so they built a radar into a helicopter, the S-3 Sea King, and it was kind of retractable. It would retract upward and was in like this cloth bag. And what they would do is send the helicopter up to like 14,000 feet in order to be able to get better radar coverage and a better warning of when the Argentine A4 Skyhawks and Daggers were coming in. But even at 11,000 feet, that gives you a radar horizon of 129 miles, but you still have all of this mountainous terrain that they can hide behind, which is why you want to put up more of these airborne radars so that you have total coverage down in these valleys and these abysses. Sophistication of these radar systems has obviously improved because now the Aegis cruisers can track ballistic missiles or satellites coming over the horizon up to 300,000 feet. The USS Lake Erie actually shot down a satellite that was behind the radar horizon, moving at 17,500 miles an hour, which meant that they had to shoot the SM-3 missile before the radar could even see the satellite coming over the horizon because it was moving so fast. Lake Erie was able to lock on to the satellite and engage it with this SM-3 surface-to-air missile. And in an amazing feat, the missile hit about 6 inches from the door where this hydrazine fuel cell was, which was the actual aim point. It was an incredible thing. I got to listen to the crew of the Aegis cruiser that did this, and to listen to them talk about how they did this was simply amazing. Shooting down a satellite that was moving at 17,500 miles an hour and then directing a radar-guided missile to a point on the satellite that was within 6 inches of the door that had the very volatile hydrazine fuel in it. I mean, it's really an amazing story. When you are able to network a radar system like you have on the AWACS or the E-2 Hawkeye with electronic intelligence airplanes like the RC-135 Rivet Joint, and tie those in with satellites that are monitoring electronics or communications, it really is an incredible web, and the information that you get is truly phenomenal and is why we're able to do a lot of the things that we do, particularly where theater ballistic missile defense is concerned. Because now you've got something coming over the horizon, like, say, a cruise missile that's moving fast with a big warhead hunting your ships. And again, it may be launched by a Bear bomber that's only traveling at, say, 400, 500 feet, maybe 100 miles out, and you have very little time to react to that Kent cruise missile that's inbound to your Aegis cruiser. So whenever we went into planning all of our electronic warfare stuff, figuring out the gaps in our radar coverage was a really, really big deal, particularly in mountainous terrain like Afghanistan, or let's just say mountainous terrain like Taiwan and the coast of China. Not so much in the ocean that's fairly flat, but then you have other things that affect your radar waves like humidity, heat, moisture, that you've also got to take into consideration when you're planning where your radar footprint is going to be and how you're going to detect over the horizon targets. Now, take for instance a KC-135. We're a big radar target, a really big radar target. And of course, somebody can pick us up from a long way, but even a big radar target like a KC-135 can hide in that shadow of the beyond the horizon edge, and we can do things down low. This is the reason why low altitude refueling was created. When I was flying the KC-135, and again, the KC-10 was certified to do this too, we had low altitude refueling procedures with certain types of aircraft. Low altitude refueling was based on the type of receiver and also on the operational need. Now, let's talk about that for just a second. Types of receivers. We refuel the A-10 typically between 9 and 11,000 feet. The A-10 has the same engines as the S-3 Viking, and with those 10 external hardpoints loaded down with weapons, filled with fuel, it's very tough for the A-10 to get up any higher. We had to deal with the mountain ranges in Afghanistan. Soup Campbell, in a previous episode, when he was talking about flying over Afghanistan, talked about flying up high to refuel in the 19, 20, 21,000 foot range, and what a problem it was because he was so heavy and was getting heavier. In those situations, we do what's called a toboggan, where we establish contact with the receiver and go into about a 300 foot per minute rate of descent so that they have some throttle response to stay on the boom. But normally, we're in about the 9 to 11,000 foot range when refueling the A-10 Warthog because of its performance. Another class of airplanes that we have to refuel down low are all of the Air Force Special Operations Command aircraft, such as the MC-130 and the AC-130. Some of this is due, once again, to performance issues, particularly in the case of the AC-130. An AC-130 loaded down with its 105 rounds, its 40 millimeter gun rounds, now they're carrying small diameter bombs, plus all their gas. They're very heavy. And so to refuel them, we've had to come down lower based on the performance of the MC-130 and the AC-130 because of their thrust to weight problem. And in some cases where the AC-130 is concerned, they're not able to get above, say, 9,000, 10,000 feet to refuel because they're so bogged down. They're so heavy, which is why we refuel the AC-130s on some of our special operations missions at 3,000 feet. Now, we have tactics, techniques, and procedures that have been developed over a very long period of time that were called gin bear procedures. And that was on all of our C-130 air refuelings, we do what's called an overtaking rendezvous. The MC AC-130s will actually roll out about a half mile in front of us, and we will fly over the top of them. And they will then ascend up to the boom and get their gas. We use night vision goggles to help during those rendezvous. And this is right out of the air refueling manual. I'm not telling you anything that is not classified here, but we only had certain crews in a particular squadron in the States at McConnell that were the folks that practice low altitude refueling at 3,000 feet. These KC-135 tankers were called Christines because they were air refuelable. There was only 8 of them. And I don't know how many are still left in the inventory, but when I was flying, there was 8 air refuelable KC-135s that we called Christines that would do these Special Operations Command receivers. And they used these night vision goggle overtaking rendezvous procedures in order to do it. When I went to Kadena and was part of the 909th Air Refueling Squadron, we were also low altitude capable and qualified. We had to have, I think it was 3 rides in order to get that qualification. And here's how we did it. Because we had the 353rd Special Operations Group with MC-130s on the ramp at Kadena, we were their air refueling asset. And what was really cool was the 353rd SOG MC-130s went to really cool places like India, Malaysia, Singapore, and they began taking a tanker with them everywhere they went, which was a good deal for the tanker guys and gals. So my very first low altitude training mission, we did a 353rd SOG Special Operations Group MC-130 that was going down toward the Philippines. We did an en route rendezvous with them at 3,000 feet and an overtaking rendezvous where we flew over the top of them. And it was about 10 o'clock in the morning at 3,000 feet. My crew was doing what we call an over the shoulder, watching a qualified crew do all of these procedures. Naturally, I had my camera with me, and it's a good thing I did. Going back to the boom pod, I had to see this. I had to see what this looked like being at 3,000 feet over the water. There was intermittent clouds. The sea was fairly choppy that day too, if I remember right. And I remember going back into the boom pod, laying down, the boom operator looking at me, big smile on his face because he saw me with the camera. And I looked outside and I see this MC-130 in the pre-contact position getting ready to come up and connect with us. And I'm like looking at this, I'm like, oh, this is so cool to watch. We were at 220,000 pound gross weight. That was the maximum gross weight the tanker could refuel low altitude, because we had to slow down to 220 knots, which meant we had to put our flaps down to 20 degrees, and our flap speed was 220 knots. Airplane shook a little bit, made the air behind the KC-135 a little unstable, but again, the MC-130's down about 50 feet, so it's not really affecting them. As we offloaded gas, we could bring the flaps up when we were at about 210 knots, but the problem that we had with doing these kinds of receivers, oh, by the way, the A-10 we refuel at 220 knots also, most of the time at 210. But here's the issue. Our boom got mushy at 190 knots. The rudder vaders, because they're so small, had to have at least 190 knots of airspeed going across them. Otherwise, the boom wouldn't move real well. So we always tried to stay above 200 knots, around 210 knots when we're refueling the A-10s down low, and of course the MC-130 and AC-130 gunship. On this training mission, the instructor pilot up front, a very dear friend who I'm sorry to say has passed away, lived next door to us in the building next door to us, was the Stanival pilot, said, "Hey guys, we're approaching something." And of course, as soon as I heard him say that, the airplane went into a slight left bank. And I went, "What's happening?" And the boom was looking at me smiling and laughing because he knew what he was talking about. What they saw out in front of them was a fishing boat, a Philippine fishing boat on the water. And of course, he turned to it to go over the top of it at 3,000 feet. Big tanker, big MC-130, and the MC-130 is painted gunship gray and green and everything. So you got this two dark shapes running at you. I guess they could hear us coming, and of course they're looking around, and he flew right over the top of that fishing boat. And as it went underneath us, I could see it out the window, and we could see the fishermen diving into the wheelhouse as we went over the top of them. It was just a good laugh. Again, one of those great things that I will always remember about my flying career. One of those great events, low altitude refueling, flying over this fishing boat off the coast of the Philippines. Can you imagine the story that those guys had when they went and got back in port? "Hey, didn't catch very many fish, but saw a really cool thing flying over the top of us that scared us to death." We went on this mission and landed at Clark Air Base. And another technique, and procedure that we did with tankers in Pacific Air Forces was we did what was called aircraft surge launch and recovery approaches and landings into the air bases. Because we had all of these fighters, we would actually integrate fighters and tankers into these what we called ASLAR recovery procedures, and you fly them at 300 knots, even in the tanker. And we had to switch up our landing checklist because you can't have the flaps down and the speed breaks up, and we had to make some changes in our landing checklist in order to be able to fly these approaches. You come down, you're going 300 knots right to the final approach fix, or this drag point, where airplanes, when they go across the drag point, they call the drag point out and they slow to their final approach speed. And once you go over this drag point, this slowdown point, we would begin to put the speed brakes down, put the flaps down with the throttles at idle, which is not in the books. You're not supposed to, do idle power approaches. But that was, again, one of the things that we did in order to be able to integrate with the fighters that were doing these same ASLAR approaches. And I got to do my first ASLAR approach at Clark Air Base. And of course I screwed it up. It was the very first one I'd ever done in my life. I'm flying the approach at 300 knots. But that's another story for another time. Well, I fly two more rides, again, with the same Stanival pilot. And I can picture his face. I can't remember his name. And he passed away a number of years ago, which I'm so sorry because he was a really good instructor. Got my certification. And we would have to do low altitude air refueling every quarter with the 353rd SOG in order to maintain our currency. And of course, when you're taking your check rides, everything goes wrong. And as we were getting ready after takeoff to go out and refuel our MC-130 from the 353rd Special Operations Group, we found out that the F-15s had the high block and were doing gunnery practice on a dart. So we couldn't use the low altitude block because there's 20 millimeter bullets flying all over everywhere. I got on the radio with the MC-130 that we were supposed to refuel. And I said, hey, where are you guys going? He says, well, we're going up to the Korean Peninsula. We're going to Osan. Perfect. And so what we did is we arranged for us to do low altitude refueling at 3,000 feet with the MC-130 through Naha by asking for a block altitude along the low altitude airway. And we were able to do the rendezvous, do the hookup, pass the gas, do all those kinds of things that you had to do for your check ride. I just remember this helmet fire we had in the cockpit. Oh no, we can't go into our assigned area and do our air refueling because there's 20 millimeter bullets being shot at this dart that's on a cable 1,500 feet behind this Learjet. What are we going to do to get the check ride over with? And finding out where the MC-130 was going and what he was doing, we were able to arrange all this. Now, there's a lot of islands in between Okinawa and the Korean Peninsula. And it was just really cool flying over all of these little islands to the northwest of Okinawa because there's fishing boats everywhere. And if I remember right, it was early summer, late spring, early summer. The performance of the airplanes was really good, and it was just fun to do it. And of course, we were at the right gross weight in my airplane to do it. We knew that we were going to do a check ride with the MC-130, but since we were going farther, we actually had used more gas to get there. And fortunately, we could maintain 210 knots with the flaps up, and it went swimmingly. As a matter of fact, I got an excellent on the ride for thinking through all of these issues that we had on this particular check ride. But this training continued all throughout the 5 years I was at Kadena. I got certified very early. All of the crews were certified in low altitude refueling. We had the MC-130s there on the base that required refueling at low altitude at 3,000 feet or 10,000 feet. Of course, the fighter guys were also looking at this, but that was another restriction we had on our airplanes. Because the KC-135 was so old, Boeing said that the warranty on the airframe would be null and void if we did 315 knot low altitude refueling, because it puts a lot of pressure on the airplane going that fast and a lot of pressure on the airframe. Now, of course, we've done low altitude refueling for short periods of time with the fighter guys, particularly one, we had an emergency where one of the main gear didn't come down correctly and we had to give the guy more gas so he could do his checklist items and come in and take a barrier. But we didn't do low altitude refueling with the F-15s and the fighters because we had to do it at 315 knots. The Navy, we did at 275, so it wasn't so hard on the airframe. But that was one of the reasons we didn't do it with fighters, was because of this restriction on the airframe and the warranty on these old airplanes. Now, of course, whenever you're doing air refueling out over the ocean, one of our biggest briefing items is, of course, bird strikes. There are a lot of waterfowl and sea-going birds, seagulls, cormorants, and all kinds of things that are, of course, flying at 3,000 feet. So our briefing had to include what happens if we take a bird in the windshield or what happens if we take a bird in the engines. Now, I started my certification in the old water wagons, the old A models, and pretty much a seagull could go down one of the old J57 engines and just get spit out the back. A seagull going into a CFM56 was a completely different issue. Now, I remember doing an operational mission with the 353rd Special Operations Group, MC-130, that was carrying Special Forces folks in the back. I later found out from news reports it was a SEAL team, and they were going to some islands in southern portion of the Philippines to deal with some terrorist groups that were down there. In our briefing with the 353rd Flight Crew, the intelligence officer had already done the calculation of where our flight path was at 3,000 feet and the radar horizon was. And of course, being a good intel officer figuring this out, he figured out the exact number and then added like about 20% to it to give us a bit of a buffer so that we knew we were under the radar. Because again, we're being sneaky. We're doing some things here that we don't want people to watch. While we were doing this mission, we do what's called due regard, where we tell ATC we are going to go due regard descending, and we are going to pop up back at this point, at this altitude, and expect an IFR clearance at that point, at that time. We fly VFR flight rules during that time period, staying very clear of clouds, and we turn our squawks off. When you're flying due regard like this, you basically become your own air traffic controller, and you have to watch out for whatever's around you. Now, in the old A models that didn't have the Pacer Crag system, that was kind of tough. We didn't expect anybody to be down at 3,000 feet, but there was airplanes flying down around 3,000 feet because there's all these little Cessnas and everything running around joyriding. And of course, this great big tanker with an MC-130 on the boom goes by it at 210 knots and gave him quite a show, I'm sure. But once we were fueling complete, we gave him, I think, about 12,000 pounds. We separated from them. They went lower and flew the rest of their flight at a lower altitude. And I'm not going into the specifics of that. And we climbed up to a VFR altitude, I think of 10,500 feet, called air traffic control, said, hey, we're air refueling complete. We'd like our IFR clearance, flight level 270. Of course, they read it back to us, and we made the climbing left-hand turn, went back to Okinawa. Operationally, I've done missions like this, and it's just cool to do because it's one of those things that's out of the ordinary. We were a certified crew to do it, and it was just fun to do. To be down at 3,000 feet, kind of your own boss with this MC-130 on the boom, that was, in fact, flying an operational mission under some code word and some operational name to go deal with this terrorist training group that said, we're going to kidnap Americans, we're going to torture Americans and do stuff to them. They got a visit from our MC-130 brothers and the Special Forces guys, the SEAL team that was in the back. Let me revisit with you fighter planes once again. Even though Boeing told us, hey, these are old airframes and all the turbulence and everything is going to stress out these old KC-135 airplanes and the KC-10s, that doesn't mean we didn't do low altitude air refueling with fighters at 315 knots. I personally never did low altitude refueling with fighters at 3,000 feet at 315 knots during the time period I was at Kadena. That is not what the F-15 guys and gals wanted there. Because of their radar footprint being optimized when they're in the 30 to 32,000 foot range, where you have one F-15 that's got his radar looking low and one F-15 that's got her radar looking high, so that they've got this overlapping radar coverage. That is not done at low altitude. But F-16s and F-15Es have done operational missions where they were refueling at low altitude. And I'm going to give you some examples of where this happened. It's pretty rare that you have really bumpy, turbulent air out over the ocean. So when we were doing fighters at 3,000 feet out over the ocean, we were a little more comfortable with the stress on the KC-135. And my KC-10 folks tell me they were a little more comfortable doing low altitude AR out over the ocean also. There have been cases where KC-135s and the KC-10 have refueled F-15E Strike Eagles and F-16s at low altitude. And let me give you two examples that I know of. In November of 1979, a bunch of Iranians got into the U.S. Embassy in Tehran and took 52 Americans hostage for 444 days. Those hostages were released when Ronald Reagan became president in January of 1981. Now, there were all kinds of plans that were created on how we're going to go in and get these hostages. And of course, one of them was Operation Eagle Claw, which failed miserably in April of 1980. There was 2 carriers there at the time, the USS Coral Sea, older carrier, and of course, the USS Nimitz, which was fairly new and a nuclear carrier. A number of plans were being created on how we could get the hostages out or how we could really, really hurt the Iranians, because some of their air bases were right along the northern Arabian Gulf. Of course, the hostages were being held in downtown Tehran, and there wasn't any way we were going to be able to get to them with air power. Several contingency plans were created to really hurt their air defenses and their airfields and Air Force. I talked to a KC-10 pilot that was deployed over there during the Iran hostage crisis. And what they were doing was they were practicing how to get U.S. fighter bombers into Iran and cripple their air defenses in some of their airfields. And you have to remember, they're flying F-14 Tomcats. They've got a lot of other airplanes they're flying too, but they've got some of our top-of-the-line fighter jets at this time period, which really posed a threat. The KC-10s were practicing one of these contingency operations out over the deserts of Saudi Arabia. I'm not sure where the fighters were coming out of. The fighter bases are mostly at like KKMC, King Khalid Military City, Tabuk. There's some down near Jeddah, obviously, where our F-111s were out of. But these KC-10s were doing these 3,000-foot air refueling training and just kind of working out some of the bugs of what it would be like to refuel down low across the deserts. It's particularly dangerous at night to do this kind of stuff. You're flying partially blacked out with certain lights on and most of your lights off. And of course, the desert is very inhospitable terrain. And flying out over the desert, you can get this spatial disorientation because you don't know what's up and what's down. You have to really be careful. I noticed this when I was doing air refueling with the F-117s, and we would be flying across the desert to the south to Khamis. And I remember looking down at the ground and up at the sky, there was a lot of lights on the ground. It was Bedouins out in the middle of the desert. Well, on a moonless night, you had no horizon, a lot of stars, and a lot of trucks or whatever running around out in the desert. So there was a spatial disorientation issue, but that was even more pronounced when you're down low at 3,000 feet refueling these fighter jets. Going fast, 350 knots, 3,000 feet above the ground, there's not a lot of margin for error and potential for this spatial disorientation to come on you. It really screws you up. What I was told by this KC-10 pilot was they were refueling down low F-111s out of Lakenheath, the 48th Statue of Liberty wing. They were doing 3,000-foot refuelings, and they were practicing to kind of see how this would work behind KC-10s. This plan never went into action. It was never executed. But the KC-10, which is a very big airplane, as you know, if I remember right at this time, they were the blue and white paint scheme too. So it's not too hard to discern a big KC-10 driving around as a white top when you're down low at night. And this KC-10 pilot, I wish I could remember his name, I remember his face, told me that it was one of the scariest missions he did in the KC-10, doing these low altitude refuelings, you know, as a piece of cake for the 111 guys, because they're used to being down low, but not the KC-10 guys, particularly where you get in the middle of the desert and up is down and down is up on a moonless night. You really have to be careful. Operation Eagle Claw, helicopter runs into a C-130. A lot of guys die. They're able to get everybody out of this sandstorm that was causing all the problems and recover. And of course, the Iranians go out in the middle of the desert to Desert One. They see the wrecked C-130s. They see the wrecked helicopters, some of the burned bodies. And of course, that gives them an incredible media blitz, makes Khomeini and his regime feel even more powerful. Now, let's fast forward to Operation Desert Storm. When I got to Jeddah in December of 1990, I was read in by Lieutenant Colonel Bruce. I can't remember his last name. That was his first name. And he told me, here is the opening night game plan. And as he laid the chart out in front of me, which was an operational navigational chart, an ONC, I noticed that there was one air refueling track that went about 30 miles into Iraqi airspace. And I let him explain the opening 3 days to me and all the things that are going to go on. And then he said, okay, what questions you got? And I said, yeah, I got a question right now. What is this? And I pointed to this air refueling track that started in the middle of Saudi Arabia and went all the way into Iraqi airspace, about 30 miles, if I remember. And it was right under or really near Lime Pre, which I flew the first night, and the one that was next to us, the name escapes me. I said, what is this? He goes, oh, that's something really special. And I go, what's that? That's a low altitude refueling track. And I said, what? And he goes, yeah, that's a planned low altitude refueling track for F-15E Strike Eagles. Can you tell me more about this? And he goes, well, the R models will have to fly it out of Riyadh because the A models from here won't have enough gas to give to the 24 F-15E Strike Eagles from Seymour that were going to use this particular track. I noticed during one revision that thing went away, and we were all happy that it did. Well, there was another revision to the opening night game plan, and it showed back up. It was there again. And here's what happened. On the opening night of Desert Storm, a 5-ship of KC-135 R models met 24 F-15E Strike Eagles, and what they did is they ramped down to low altitude refueling from a medium altitude. And what they were doing was basically going down the edge of the radar black space, the radar shadow, to get the F-15Es into Iraq completely full of gas. Their targets that opening night were to go in and find all of the fixed Scud theater ballistic missile facilities and wipe them out. So they worked out this plan that the 5 KC-135s would descend and refuel the 24 Strike Eagles that were going to go in and hit these fixed Scud sites. They actually planned this a couple times, and I understand they flew it, I think, twice. And then the opening night of Operation Desert Storm, there was a lot of cloud cover, and we had thunderstorms north of the Saudi-Iraqi border. In the book Strike Eagle, it relates this particular story. All of the KC-135s are flying at night with all of this weather around them, doing this descending to low altitude refueling profile with their lights off. And that had always been a real bone of contention with some folks in Strategic Air Command about flying these big, huge formations, 5 ships of tankers without any lighting. Now, of course, we could see it on radar, but really the lighting was a better way to stay in formation. And these guys are doing it with their lights off, and they're descending in the weather. In the book Strike Eagle, all of the F-15E guys say it was one of the scariest things I ever did in my F-15 career, was this crazy, nutty, descending to low altitude air refueling thing that we did with this 5-ship of tankers, because it was chaos. The tanker guys are worried about being seen. There's all this weather. They've got their lights off, and it's just a formation nightmare for everybody that's involved. One of the lessons learned from this is, hey, if we're going to do this low altitude stuff and we're trying to be sneaky, and so we kind of went back and readjusted our lighting on the tanker. And one of the problems that we had and was identified during that war was our overwing light on the fuselage that shines down on the top of the wings, points directly into the eyes of the guys and gals that are on the wing of the KC-135. The KC-10 does not have that problem because of one lighting change that they made on the KC-10. and that is the KC-10 has those great formation slime lights. Those yellow-green, gooey-looking lights, that's why we call them slime lights, on the fuselage, on the tail, on the wingtips, that the KC-135 didn't have. Another lesson learned. Having those slime lights was an advantage, not a disadvantage, because the KC-10 could turn all of its lights off, leave those slime lights on, which are low intensity, and you could fly formation off the KC-10. Wasn't the same with the KC-135, and we had different techniques at the different bases for where we were setting our lighting. We at Jeddah, because we had a lot of guard guys who'd flown in fighter units, had developed a partial lighting technique where we had some of them on, some of them off, all of them on, all of them off that we used. But when we realized that the real threat to each other was not the Iraqis, but us running into each other, we went full lights on, full up so that we could be seen. That did not happen during this crazy descending 5-ship KC-135 low-level air refueling tasking where we refueled these F-15Es. All of the guys that were interviewed in Strike Eagle talked about how crazy and hairy this was. One guy, in fact, says, hey, turn your lights up. And the 135s were saying, hey, we're not going to get tapped by Iraqi Air Force. Well, for crying out loud, you've got 24 F-15Es around you. All of them are carrying Sidewinder missiles. You're not going to get tapped by an Iraqi Air Force fighter because the F-15Cs are too busy knocking them all down that first night anyway. And the F-15Es are doing self-escort because they're armed with 4 AIM-9 Mike Sidewinder missiles. Here's another reason I think this was a problem. In Strategic Air Command, in all of our regulations, it says that KC-135s and Strategic Air Command predominantly will fly IFR flight rules to the max extent possible. The problem with that is when we go to war, in a conventional war, we are using VFR rules. We fight in a conventional air campaign like Shock and Awe, Afghanistan, Desert Storm, using VFR flight rules, which was totally foreign to the KC-135 community. We were used to flying indicated airspeed and not ground speed. The fighters do all of their planning in ground speed. We did all of ours in indicated airspeed. So there's a disparity there. Not a really big one, but there is a difference between those two speeds. It may only be a couple knots, but when you're fighter guys, that makes a big difference over a longer mission. What I'm saying is Strategic Air Command was so focused on our nuclear mission and doing our nuclear mission by calibrating airspeeds completely differently than our conventional fighter bomber receiver, which is why when I talked to John Boy Walton and Kevin, my nav, talked to John Boy Walton on the phone in preparation for the opening night where we were fueling the Weasels, Coors, Lone Star, and Michelob. I made sure we knew what ground speed they wanted to keep in order to maintain their timing. That did not happen with this particular air refueling from what I've heard. And again, this is all training issues. This is all stuff that we should have worked out in Desert Storm, and we didn't. And it caused problems because of the way Tactical Air Command and Strategic Air Command accomplished their respective missions. As far as I know, the opening night of Desert Storm is the only time they did this crazy descending low altitude air refueling with all these Strike Eagles, because everybody realized what a hazard it was based on what the weather was going to be like for the next couple days. And if I remember right, I think it was night 3, my crew was leading another 5-ship of Tuna KC-135A models, but we were up high. We were 21 blocking to 24, if I remember right, refueling Strike Eagles that were going into Iraq to pound down some more of these fixed Scud ballistic missile sites. I'll never forget that mission either, because I remember the Strike Eagles pulling up next to us. They had their lights up the slime lights particularly, they had their rotating beacons off, if I remember. But what was really strange was you had these gunship gray Strike Eagles carrying bright white rockeye bombs, these cluster bombs. The Strike Eagle was so new that they hadn't done all of the weapon separation tests on them yet. And so they were carrying non-precision guided munitions on some of these particular missions that they were flying. They were flying with non-precision guided weapons because they hadn't done the Seek Eagle separation tests for like the GBU-12s, the GBU-10s, which they were doing furiously back home so they could begin using their targeting pods, the Lantern targeting pods, to drop GBU-12s, GBU-10s. But I remember this four-ship, I think their call sign was Stingray, pulling up outside the window. You have this blacked out airplane and these bright white Rockeye Mark 20 bombs on the conformal fuel tank bomb racks. It was really eerie, something that, like I said, I'll always remember. And I wish I could have taken a picture of this at night or videotaped it. And I think maybe my co-pilot, Kenny, he may have videotaped it out his window because it was so weird just seeing the slime lights, the dark airplanes, and then these bright white bombs that were being illuminated by our lights, which made them even brighter. Man, folks, I look back on Desert Storm and I think to myself, we really talked a good talk about fighting jointly, but we weren't there yet. And we had a lot to learn about how to fight a conventional large force air campaign. You know, of course, we went to Red Flag and did all that where we had this large force. We did it in the daytime, we did it at night, but we really didn't share information much between Strategic Air Command tankers and our fighter and bomber brothers in Tactical Air Command and Strategic Air Command. Don't even get me started about the Navy. We didn't have any clue as to how the Navy did their business, which I talked about in our previous episode when we set up the KC-135 Weapons School. We were going out to the aircraft carrier every week and we were learning on-the-job training, on the fly, how they did business, which really helped us. But we never put that in writing. We never codified it until we set up the KC-135 Weapons School. And now that we have the KC-135 Weapons School, guess what? The Weapons School requires you to have low-altitude navigation training and skills. And the KC-135 Weapons School does some low-altitude training up through the mountains and lakes north of the base now, which would have really been helpful back during Desert Storm. This story is about probably one of the most incredible airstrikes in air warfare history. And it was very Pearl Harbor-like, where surprise had to be at the utmost for this to be pulled off. Got credible intel that there was a huge buildup of offensive weapons in a particular place, just like we're dealing with in Cuba. Not only is there credible evidence that these offensive weapons are there, but they're fairly new, just coming out of the factory, which pose an immediate threat to your forces as you're getting ready to do a very big offensive campaign, and you know that the adversary is about to do the same thing. These long-range offensive weapons were in fact confirmed by one of our allies when the Israelis gave planning group all the photos that they needed of this particular target. This was very important that they had all of this information. Otherwise, this probably would not have been done. Like in all militaries, a secret planning group gets together in some headquarters. Only a few people are read into what's going to happen. And of course, what does every planning staff do? Where are my target arms? Where are my weapons school grads? Weapons school graduate is called to the headquarters planning staff under strict secrecy to help plan this particular airstrike. And folks, this happens all the time. When some general officer planning staff is going to do some strike like this, there's always weapons school graduates involved or Top Gun graduates involved. Weapons school grad that they chose gets to the headquarters, is immediately read into the program. He's shown all the planning factors, and here's what they are. Dense radar environment. Naturally, there are long-range search radars. There are target tracking radars from multiple SAM sites in the area and in the target area. There is defensive counter-air caps flying older airplanes, but still very capable because there's a lot of them. One of the biggest planning factors of this is it's 932 nautical miles from the closest base that you have to the target area. They all sit down, start nugging out the problem. They're looking at the targets. Okay, how are we going to do this? What weapons are we going to use? And they're going through all of these different things. And they realize most of the targets that they want to hit are kind of out in the open. So precision guidance isn't necessarily needed, and we can do this with non-precision weapons. As they're looking at the dense radar environment, the electromagnetic environment, they realize, wait a minute, there's a weakness. If we take this north route here, we can kind of hide ourselves a little bit, and the radar coverage is not that good in this particular area. That means that we have mountainous terrain we have to deal with also along this northern route. So they get out their protractors and pencils, and they see that it's going to require at least 4 air refuelings, because taking this north route is 2,170 nautical miles round trip. This is a very long ride for these fighter bubbas. This is kind of like going to Libya from England and having to go the long way. And they all realize that. They all see this. And now they're working all the gas issues with their tanker expert, and they realize, hey, we're going to have to do at least 4 air refuelings, maybe a 5th, to get there and back, covering this 2,170 nautical miles. One individual on the planning staff says, hey, let's use tactical deception in this. Where can we do some diversions with either training airplanes, or is there some other area that we can work over to be able to get them, hey, look over here, not here, and see what's going on. And of course, they come up with a very good tactical deception plan for this particular airstrike. One of those planning factors, defensive counter-air fighters, how are we going to deal with that? Well, of course, we're going to have some kind of escort. Escort in the area. Oh, look, we've got F-14s over there. Now we've just complicated the air refueling problem, because we have boom receivers and we have drogue receivers. But the Tomcats are extremely capable airplane, and they've got long legs. The Tomcats had really long legs, particularly when you had external tanks on them, and they were flying a fuel conservation type of profile. So, hey, this looks like this will work. Yeah, headache having to deal with drogue and boom refueling, but, we can work all this out. So now everything's falling to the tanker plan and the gas plan. Of course, the Air Force has big tankers and medium tankers. 707s, wide body airplane like the KC-10. No problem. We can do this. Let's figure this out. And so all the tanker bubbas get together and start going through all the gas plan, and they realize gas bill going to be big. Is there some place that we can put the tankers that will allow us to get them maybe closer to some of the air refueling spots? And of course, the planning staff figures out a way to do that. Remember, folks, when we are doing exercises or goodwill visits, all of those different kinds of things, remember, we are positioning forces for something. We can use all kinds of different exercises, visits, whatever, humanitarian relief even, to say, we need our tankers to go here, we need our air assets to go here. And we've done it all the time. When we're doing a buildup for an airstrike like this, we'll often have the AWACS go to one place, the tankers go to another place, the fighters are in one place, and they'll all meet up somewhere in order to pull this off. And for this particular airstrike, it was no different. They talk to one of these countries and they go, hey, we'd like to come see you. We're going to bring one of our great big tankers in, 2 of our great big tankers in, if that's all right with you guys, and we can kind of show you what tankers do and how they operate. And because believe me, people, Everyone loves to have tankers. Everyone loves to have U.S. Air Force tankers come to their country and do some kind of exercise where they get air refueling contacts, either boom or drogue, off of a KC-135 or a KC-10. It is a huge deal when tankers show up to refuel one of our allied nations' fighters or even some of their heavy airplanes. Right before Desert Shield started, we had KC-10s that were in the United Arab Emirates refueling their Mirage fighters because we knew something was going to happen, and the UAE government said, hey, can you bring some of your tankers over so that our guys can get some contacts and get some air refueling practice? And we said, sure, we can do that. Under the guise of these kinds of exercises, we're positioning forces, getting ready for something a lot bigger, a lot bigger. One of the other planning factors you always look at is 5 planning factors. One of them, obviously, is the weather. And that's going to dictate a lot of things. And I'll just give you an example. In the Middle East, by April, it's pretty much 100 degrees across everywhere in the Middle East, except for in the northern areas like northern Turkey, northern Iran, even around Mosul. It's still not as hot as it is down in the southern portion, but you're taking off in 100-degree weather. One of the things I was asked to do to prepare for the Shock and Awe campaign is General Mosley says, hey, Sluggo, can you make a slide on some of your planning factors? I went and talked to my roommate, Fred Head, who was the head of weather for 9th Air Force. And I said, Fred, I need to know when all of our bases are going to be like 100 degrees, because that really affects our takeoff thrust, which of course affects how much gas we're taking off with. Not just in the tanker, but with our receivers. Because our receivers download gas in order to maintain their standard conventional weapons loads. Again, this is one of the things we have to look at. Fred had told me, all right, Sluggo, sometime between the 1st and 4th of April, all of our U.S. bases, except for those in the north and in Europe, will be at 100 degrees. Oman and thumb rate, of course, a lot sooner than that. So I made up this slide and it had a graph on it. Here's fuel available versus fuel required. And those two lines crossed that week of the 1st through the 4th of April, where now the tanker bill was going to go up because the fighters and bombers were taking off with less gas in order to maintain their weapons loads. We had to figure out the date and time based on the heat of when we were going to take off. This is something we always do, something that we always have to look at. Normally we go in at night. Sometimes we don't because of how far we're going to go. And of course, the fighter guys use ground speed, 8 miles a minute. So that means this strike is going to be about 4.5, possibly 5 hours long, which is going to affect gas. This is all of the things weapons school graduates are taught, particularly the tanker weapons school guys, when it comes to dealing with gas, are taught as part of our curriculum when we're putting this kind of a strike package together, going after this type of target with offensive weapons that are out in the open. And we have to do this. We have to go after these things, just like in the Cuban Missile Crisis. We had to do something. As part of this plan, it was figured out that we have to do low altitude refueling when we're performing this mission. Everybody was okay with that. The planners realized that low altitude refueling was the way to go in order to maintain operational security of the strike package. And everybody was okay with that. It's going to be a little scary, 315 knots, but we can pull it off. We'll do it. And of course, all the planners had to figure out, okay, where do we do that? Where do we rendezvous? Where do we start heading down? And all of those kinds of planning factors. And they fleshed it all out. They had a really good plan, and now it was time to execute it. Oh, one other thing I got to mention too. Do it over a weekend when people are kind of at leisure. Let's start this thing over a weekend. Let's not do it on a Sabbath day. Let's do it on a Saturday when we go into the target area. People are kind of more at leisure. So Saturday is the day they pick to do this. These are all things that we take a look at. Well, it finally comes time to do it. And this particular weapons school grad, he's the one that's going to brief everything. Whenever you're going to do a mission, particularly a really, really complex one like this, you always have the weapons school grad who planned the mission brief the crews. Gets into the room with the crews, selected crews, tells them, hey, this is what you're going to do. This is the plan. And they all go, what? What are we doing? And he shows the route of flight, all of the planning factors. They're going to refuel down low, and they're going to fly a 4.5 hour to 5 hour mission, strike all of these offensive weapons that are scattered all over this particular target area, and then fly back home. Now, you can imagine the shock on all these pilots' faces as this weapons school grad gets up there and briefs the whole plan, comm plan, route of flight, alibis, command and control, everything. Tells them all the stuff that they're going to do on this particular airstrike. And they all go, okay, looks like a pretty good plan. We're going to do it. And I don't know if they practiced it or not. And I've got to look into that and find out, did they do a dry rehearsal for this particular mission? But folks, imagine a fighter guy, at least you're doing it during the daytime. And imagine a fighter guy coming into a briefing room. They throw up the map and the chart and all the planning stuff. They start handing out the lineup cards, and they're looking at all this going, wow, 4.5, 5 hours through the mountains, across the desert to the strike area, coming back. This really, really hinges on the tanker rendezvous and getting our gas. Otherwise, we're going to be ejecting out of the airplanes in some fairly inhospitable places with probably some inhospitable people that aren't concerned about our welfare. I have been in briefings like this where we had a weapons officer, Weeby Young was his name, get up and say, okay, here's what we're getting ready to do. Now, I had done the air refueling planning for all this, but the crews didn't know about all of this. We had come in over the weekend and done all the planning and everything, and then briefed the crews Monday morning to do this mission where we were going to go up and defend the DMZ from Kim Jong-il, because he says, I'm burying my dad in Seoul. And you can imagine there were some pretty shocked faces in the crowd, but we're very professional. They go, okay, I get to do this, and it's going to be pretty cool. We had a deception plan where all of the F-15s were tucked under the tanker's wings so that we presented like one radar target with 3 tankers and no F-15s. We were flying in like a radar resolution cell. Last thing I want to tell you, flying these kinds of missions, these kind of complex things where you know you're going to make air warfare history is a lot of pressure. But man, when you are doing this, you're very focused on the mission, getting it done. And when you get back to the base and you're done with this mission, you are euphoric. You have this dopamine high that really can't be described. And your buddies that flew this mission with you are feeling the exact same thing. And I'm sure when this strike package got home and everybody got around the bar, there was a lot of toasting going on and there was a lot of adult beverages being consumed. 10:30 a.m., all of the airplanes start taking off from their respective bases. All of the airplanes are going to meet over a very prominent geographical reference point, a massive lake, which everybody can find. It's a pretty good sized lake. So what better way to do a rendezvous than over something that everybody will recognize? And of course, everybody meets up like they're supposed to. There's 8 fighters with 2 spares on the tankers. They all meet up, they do their boom checks, everything works good. So off they go with the strike package, and they ramp down to low altitude. Probably the lowest altitude that has ever been done in air refueling. The tankers have the strikers on them. They're going to do 2 refuelings in, 2 refuelings out, which means you're going to have other tankers meet up with you. But remember, we have tankers close to the operational area because we're doing this kind of diplomatic goodwill visit, and it's all going to work out. Now, they get to the border and they go really low altitude. They're in mountainous terrain and they figured out a way to get through it. And The fighter guys that did this particular mission said it was one of the scariest things we've ever done. But we were very focused on our mission, very focused on what we were going to do, because we knew that these offensive weapons were going to be used against us. And we just had to do it. So we did. There was very little margin for error because they were doing this at 300 feet, 315 knots, with fighters on the tankers throughout this route of flight. They came out of the mountainous terrain to the north of the objective because, again, this is where the radar coverage is at its weakest, made the left-hand turn to the southwest, maintained 300 feet while they were refueling on the way to the target area. The weapons school grad is actually in the command and control airplane, listening to all of this and kind of directing traffic. And of course, they're doing this all calm out too, but they're able to follow their progress. The strike package gets abeam the target area and goes to work. Now, I am very familiar with this particular target area. Just before we went into the shock and awe campaign, I don't know what was going on out there, but there was a lot of special forces soldiers running around out in this area. And one night we were smacking this place down hard. We had F-15Es that were dropping bombs. We had Bones that were dropping bombs. We had 16 Wild Weasels for the SAMs, all of these different things on this particular target area. And it's a big place too, okay? 3 runways, for crying out loud. Where was this airfield? It was the H-3 complex in Iraq. And I just remember looking up at the board, and we had just gotten permission to move the tankers up into what was called the Honus MOA, named after Honus Wagner. We had just gotten permission to move all the anchor areas up into that area, which helped the gas problem with the Bones and the fighters and everything that were going in there. But man, we were dropping a lot of bombs on the H-3 complex that particular night. A lot of precision guided munitions, all of them like 2,000 pounders and GBO-12 500-pound laser guided bombs dropping on the H-3 complex. And I remember asking myself, watching it on the board, I'm like, what's going on out there? What are they doing out there? And the soft guys told me, oh, we found a lot of things that we needed to deal with out there before we started what we're getting ready to do for Shock and Awe. I said, okay, fine. Well, in this particular airstrike that I'm talking about, where we're doing low altitude air refueling, the H-3 complex was the same target. And what I'm talking about is this long range airstrike that happened on the 4th of April during the daytime on the H-3 complex in 1981. The Iranian Air Force saw that brand new French Mirages and Tu-22 bombers from Russia had been put on the airfield and were out in the open during the Iran-Iraq war. And they were doing a surprise attack on the airfield to take out some of these aircraft. And they were extremely successful. They split up into 2 groups. The Iranian F-4s, there was 6 F-4Es, so 6 of them have a gun, and 2 F-4Ds, all of them carrying bombs that went in and started decimating the H-3 complex in the afternoon of the 4th of April, 1981. The plan was accomplished by a colonel by the name of Faridun Izzatsata. Spell that name, I-Z-A-D-S-E-T-A. Faridun, or Fred Izzatsata. He's the guy in the command and control airplane. He's also the weapons school grad. Yes, the United States Air Force Weapons School. Under the Shah, some of the F-4 pilots had gone through the Air Force's weapons school, and he was a patch wearer. I couldn't believe this when I found this out. An Iranian patch wearer in the F-4. And he's the guy that's directing traffic from the command and control airplane, which was a 747 out of Damascus. The Iranian Air Force has 707s, like the KC-135 tankers. They have 707 tankers that came out of their base, met the F-4s over Urima Lake, ramped down to low altitude to 300 feet, refueling at 315 knots. These F-4s loaded with bombs going to strike the H-3 complex. And they took it by total surprise. The anti-aircraft guns weren't firing. They tried to get some MiGs off and some fighters off. They were unsuccessful. They dropped their bombs. And according to Iranian records, they destroyed 48 airplanes, Iraqi Air Force airplanes, on the airfield during the few minutes that they were over the airfield. Now, the F-4s dropped their bombs. The D models don't have guns. The F-4Es, the 6 F-4Es came in, expended all their 20 millimeter ammunition on other targets, other airplanes that were out in the open, and left the place burning. Went to the west, hooked up with a 747 tanker at 300 feet, and refueled on the way home. I found Colonel Izzat Sada, and I talked to him on the phone today for a few moments. We're going to have him on as a guest here in a couple weeks. He wrote a book about his life in Iran as an Iranian Air Force officer. It's called Immortals of the Sky. It's available on Amazon, and he now lives in the United States. And I found his phone number. And we talked for a few minutes about this particular raid. He said, refueling Mark at 300 feet behind a 747 was one of the scariest things I ever did in an airplane. Because at 315 knots, you've got maybe 2 seconds to react if something goes wrong. Heaven forbid you have a breakaway. Where are you going to go? Because you've only got 300 feet below you. And he said, we did what we had to do, Mark. We planned it that way, and we pulled it off. And Colonel Fred, as I call him, now lives in the United States, has been here for 35 years, I think he said. He moved over here in 1985 or 86 with his family. His children all live around him close. In a couple weeks, when we figure out the date and time of all this, I'm going to have Colonel Feridun Izzat Sada on the podcast. That is going to be an amazing podcast to hear him. And he speaks really good English, too. I mean, he's been here for 35 years, and I'm really anxious to talk to him. He told me, he says, hey, call me in the evenings and we'll talk about what we want to talk about and everything. And so we'll have him on here in a couple weeks. But folks, think about this. 300 feet, 315 knots. That's what we refueled F-4s at. Little room for air. And they pull off one of the greatest airstrikes of air warfare history on the H-3 complex, destroying 48 airplanes, to include the Tu-22s, and of course they had Tu-16s there, and damaged those also. 48 airplanes destroyed or damaged on this airfield during this strike. An amazing feat of aerial warfare, navigating when they don't have GPS. They're just using their inertial navigation systems in the airplanes to get to and from where they're going. You know, clock to map to ground, typical low altitude kind of navigation. And it'll be great to hear from Colonel Fred and how he did this. I hope you've enjoyed this episode of the Lessons from the Cockpit podcast, the 56th episode of our podcast. And I hope all of you have a better understanding of the hows and whys of low altitude refueling and have really been educated and entertained by some of these stories. I'm really looking forward to talking to Colonel Fred about his experience 300 feet, 315 knots refueling on this particular mission. His book is called Immortals of the Sky. It is on Amazon. The hardback, I think, was about $48. The softback was, I think, $23. And it's in English. So, because he's been here since 1985, 1986, I would admonish all of you, go out and get his book and read that, or go by a library and see if you can find it. This episode of the Lessons from the Cockpit podcast was brought to you by Wall Pilot, aviation art for the walls of your home, office, or hangar. Please go by wallpilot.com and order some of the 127 ready to print on the website. That includes F-4s like Colonel Fred was flying, or send us a note and tell us, hey, I want this custom custom airplane done with my name on it and this unit and this weapons load, this tail number, because that's what we do also. They come in 4, 6, and 8 foot, printed on vinyl, extremely detailed, folks, and they're very, very researched when we put these things together. Please go by and order 1 or 2 of these vinyl prints, because that's how we finance the show. This and previous episodes of the Lessons from the Cockpit podcast can be found on my website, markhasera.com, under the podcast pull-down box. So go back and listen to some of the other episodes. We did a whole series on the Battle of Roberts Ridge and Takur Ghar, and some of those stories are really incredible. I talked to 2 of the helicopter pilots that got shot down. So please, folks, go back, download a couple of these episodes. They're about an hour and 20 minutes long. You know, I do it so that you can listen to them on a commute. I really appreciate all of you that have gone and downloaded and listened to my podcast. My TikTok page, I have 57 million views in less than 6 months. And some of these videos that I talk about are there, and our podcast is growing because I've got so many views. Thanks for tuning in today and listening, and we'll talk to you again next week on the Lessons from the Cockpit show.